The manor stood tall against the fading twilight, its silhouette jagged and sharp, like the teeth of a monstrous beast waiting to consume its next victim. Jonathan Moore, a historian with a passion for dark tales and forgotten secrets, could hardly believe he was standing before Blackwood Manor, a house notorious for the brutality that had plagued it for nearly a century. Perched on the outskirts of a small, forgotten village in the heart of New England, the house had earned its grim reputation through decades of bloodshed, each new owner meeting a more horrific fate than the last. Jonathan had always been drawn to the eerie and the macabre, but the stories of Blackwood Manor fascinated him in a way no other tale had. Every 10 years, without fail, another owner would die, ripped apart, mutilated, or driven to madness. The townspeople whispered of curses, spirits, and ancient rites. No one dared approach the house after sundown, yet here he was, with nothing more than his bag of research and an insatiable curiosity. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the landscape. Jonathan tightened his coat around himself, suddenly aware of the cold that clung to the air, unnatural for this time of year. As he approached the manor's grand entrance, the wind picked up, howling as if it were warning him to turn back. But his feet carried him forward, drawn by something deeper than mere fascination, a need to uncover the truth behind the manor's curse. Pushing open the heavy oak door, Jonathan stepped inside. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of rot and decay, though the manor had been vacant for years. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung like tapestries in the corners of the once opulent rooms. His footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, each one seeming to disturb the oppressive atmosphere. He couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching him, its walls filled with eyes, ancient and unseen. As he moved deeper into the house, Jonathan's mind replayed the countless stories he had gathered. The murders, though gruesome, shared a disturbing consistency. Each victim was found with symbols carved into their flesh, and their blood had been drained, not unlike an offering. The police had never found a rational explanation, dismissing the cases as the work of deranged killers. But Jonathan had uncovered something much older, something that connected all the deaths in a way the authorities had overlooked. It was an ancient ritual, detailed in a collection of texts Jonathan had discovered while researching old European folklore. The ritual spoke of a house alive, in a way that required blood to sustain itself. Each generation, it demanded a sacrifice. Those who refused to heed its call were driven to madness, or worse, consumed by the house itself. As he set up his equipment in the library, Jonathan felt the weight of the house pressing down on him. The fire in the hearth, which he had lit moments ago, sputtered and crackled in protest. He sensed movement in the shadows, though each time he turned, nothing was there. The house seemed to be alive, as if it were breathing, watching his every move. But it wasn't until he found the journal, the final diary of the last owner, a man named Edward Blackwood, that Jonathan realized just how deep the horror went. Scrawled in the final pages were the frantic, terrified words of a man who had realized too late that he had been chosen. The house knows. It watches. It feeds. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine as he read those words. The fire flickered, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the doorway. He blinked, and it was gone. Suddenly, the house seemed to hum, a low vibration filling the air, growing louder and louder. Jonathan's heart raced as he realized that he had already gone too far. The house had chosen him, just as it had chosen Edward and all those before him. And now, it wanted his blood. The night deepened as Jonathan sat motionless in the library, the journal still clutched in his hands. His mind raced with the revelations it held. Edward Blackwood, the last in the line of cursed owners, had tried to unravel the same mysteries Jonathan now sought to understand. But something lingered between the lines of Blackwood's frantic scribblings, something unspeakable. The very walls of the manor seemed to hum with an unnatural life, as though they held secrets far more ancient and horrifying than any human mind could fathom. Jonathan felt the cold, creeping tendrils of dread tighten around him. The manor, it seemed, was not merely a place, it was an entity, one that transcended the boundaries of stone and timber. And it was hungry. He forced himself to rise, though every instinct screamed for him to flee. His breath came in shallow gasps as he moved toward the staircase, intending to explore the upper floors, where the bloodiest of the murders had occurred. The air grew heavier as he ascended, thick with an unseen presence that clung to his skin like mist. Each creak of the stairs sounded like a mournful wail, a dirge sung by the house itself. At the top of the landing, Jonathan hesitated, his hand resting on the cold, rusted banister. Before him stretched a long corridor, shrouded in darkness, the doors lining its walls like mouths of some ghastly labyrinth. From somewhere deep within the manor, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper drifted through the air. It was not the wind, nor the settling of old timbers. It was a voice, faint, distant, yet laden with the weight of centuries. It seemed to call his name, though it spoke in no language known to men. The words were guttural, alien, as if uttered by a tongue long lost to the annals of time. Jonathan moved forward, driven by a force that was no longer his own. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark rhythm, in sync with his quickening heartbeat. He reached the first door, pushing it open with trembling fingers. Inside, the air was rank, heavy with the scent of decay. The room had once been a bedroom, lavish and regal, but now it was a ruin of its former self. The bed, draped in tattered, moth-eaten curtains, looked like a coffin awaiting its next occupant. As he stepped into the room, something brushed against his leg. He froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. Slowly, he looked down, expecting to see a rat or some other vermin that had claimed the manor as its home. But there was nothing. The sensation returned, this time more insistent, as if unseen fingers were trailing across his skin. A shiver of revulsion shot through him. The house was touching him. Then he saw it, a faint glimmer on the wall, barely visible in the dim light. Jonathan moved closer, his eyes narrowing as he made out a pattern, carved into the plaster with precision. It was an intricate sigil, unlike anything he had ever seen before. Its design was arcane, impossible, as if it defied the very geometry of the world. The lines twisted and curled in ways that made his vision blur and his stomach turn. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and Jonathan's breath fogged before him. The whispering voices swelled in intensity, now a cacophony of murmurs that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. The sigil began to glow, pulsing with a sickly, crimson light, like a wound bleeding through the skin of the house. A feeling of utter dread washed over him. This was no mere decoration, no idle mark left by the house's previous tenants. This was a gateway, an ancient symbol meant to draw forth something unspeakable, something that lurked beyond the veil of human comprehension. Jonathan backed away, his limbs sluggish and unresponsive, as though the house itself was sapping his strength. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, dark and commanding, though it still spoke in that unknowable language. It vibrated through his very bones, shaking the foundations of his mind. The sigil's light flared once more, casting the room in a grotesque, blood-red glow. And then he saw it. Emerging from the corner of the room, where shadows clung unnaturally thick, a figure began to take shape. Its form was indistinct, a mass of writhing darkness that seemed to shift and twist with each passing second. It moved in ways that defied logic, as though its very existence bent the fabric of reality around it. Eyes, countless eyes, blinked open from within the shadow, staring at Jonathan with an unnatural hunger. The voice from the walls grew louder, filling his mind, threatening to consume him. His legs buckled, and he fell to the floor, gasping for breath. The thing in the corner surged forward, a mass of limbs and tendrils, reaching for him with an eagerness that spoke of endless hunger. Just as the shadow reached him, Jonathan found his voice, though it was little more than a terrified whisper. Why does it take the blood?" he gasped. The voice answered, its words slithering into his mind. "Because it is owed, and always will be." The shadow loomed over him, and Jonathan's vision darkened as the house swallowed him whole. When Jonathan awoke, it was not in the cold embrace of death as he had feared, but in the depths of a suffocating, primordial darkness. His head throbbed with a dull pain, and every muscle in his body ached as though he had been dragged through some infernal chasm. The air around him was thick, oppressive, saturated with the scent of damp earth and something far more fetid, something rotten to its core. The light was gone, no flickering flames, no moonlight, only an endless void stretching before him. He tried to move, but his limbs were sluggish, bound by an unseen force that gripped him tighter than any chain. His breath came in shallow gasps as he struggled against it, but the more he fought, the more the darkness seemed to press in, like a weight crushing down upon his very soul. For the first time in his life, Jonathan felt utterly helpless, trapped within the maw of something so vast, so alien, that his mind could scarcely comprehend it. A low, rhythmic sound echoed through the abyss, like the beating of some colossal heart buried deep within the earth. With every pulse, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble, as though the very foundations of reality were quivering under the strain of an ancient, awakening force. Jonathan strained his eyes, searching for any sign of the room he had left behind, the manor, the walls, even the twisted sigil, but all had dissolved into this inky expanse. For a brief moment, he wondered if he had died. Perhaps the manor had claimed him as it had claimed so many others, and this void, was his fate. But the pain in his body told him otherwise, a cruel reminder that he was very much alive, though what that life meant now was far from certain. Suddenly, a light appeared in the distance, faint at first, but growing brighter with each passing moment. It flickered and danced like the glow of a torch, though its hue was not the warm, golden light of fire. It was a sickly green, a pallor that seemed to cast shadows where none should exist. As the light drew closer, Jonathan could make out the faint outlines of a shape moving toward him, something grotesque, humanoid but twisted, its limbs unnaturally long, its gait a slow, dragging shuffle. The figure came into view, and Jonathan's stomach lurched with revulsion. It was a man, or what had once been a man, draped in the tattered remnants of Victorian clothing, his skin stretched thin over his bones, as though he had been drained of life long ago. His eyes were hollow, vacant, but they glowed with the same sickly green light that surrounded him. His mouth hung open, revealing teeth that had been worn down to jagged nubs. The figure was impossibly tall, its fingers elongated into sharp points that scraped along the ground as it moved. Jonathan wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but remain in the presence of this abomination, but his body refused to respond. The figure stopped before him, towering over him like a specter of death, and for a moment, there was only silence, the two of them locked in a horrifying tableau. Then, the figure spoke, its voice little more than a raspy whisper, like the rustling of dead leaves. "You have been chosen." The words sent a shiver of terror down Jonathan's spine. He had read the accounts, the tales of those who had lived in the manor, the warnings scrawled in journals and letters, but nothing had prepared him for this. The figure extended one bony finger, tracing it along Jonathan's chest, and he felt a burning sensation spread through his body. It was as if his very blood was boiling beneath his skin. "It has always been this way. The house demands it. You cannot escape. The figure leaned closer, its breath rancid, like the stench of decay itself. Jonathan could see now that its eyes were not hollow, they were filled with a deep, unnatural light, as though they were windows to some otherworldly realm. In those eyes, Jonathan saw something that defied explanation, a swirling mass of colors and shapes that twisted in ways that broke the laws of nature. It was like staring into the void of the cosmos itself, where time and space held no meaning. "You will give what is owed," the figure whispered, its voice now resonating in Jonathan's mind as much as in his ears. "You are the blood. You are the sacrifice." Jonathan's mind reeled, trying to grasp the enormity of what the figure was saying. The manor, this cursed house, was not merely haunted. It was alive, sentient, and ancient beyond imagining. And it demanded blood, his blood, as it had from every owner before him. He had unknowingly stepped into a ritual older than time itself, one that transcended the earthly realm. But there was something deeper, something more horrifying that Jonathan could now feel gnawing at the edges of his mind. The house was not just an entity of flesh and blood. It was a conduit, a gateway to something far worse. The blood sacrifices weren't just to sustain the house, they were to feed something on the other side, a being whose hunger could never be satisfied. As Jonathan stared into the glowing eyes of the figure, a single, horrifying thought took root in his mind. The manor was not the end. It was only the beginning. The figure began to fade, dissolving back into the darkness from which it had come, its final words echoing in Jonathan's ears. "Your blood will be the key." The light dimmed, and Jonathan was alone again in the blackness. But now, he knew what awaited him. The house did not merely want his life, it wanted his very soul, his essence, to open the doorway to whatever lurked beyond the veil of this world. And Jonathan, helpless in the grip of the ancient power, had no choice but to obey. As the spectral figure faded into the void, Jonathan was left in the crushing silence of his own mind. He could no longer tell where the manor ended and where his terror began. The air around him grew colder, as if the very soul of the place fed on his dread. The walls, once mere stone and wood, now seemed alive, pulsing like a great, slumbering beast beneath his feet. Every shadow writhed, and every creak of the floorboards felt like the house itself shifting, hungering, watching. Jonathan staggered to his feet, his legs weak, his hands trembling as they grasped the edge of a nearby table for balance. He felt as if he had been plunged into some nightmarish purgatory, a liminal space between the living and the dead, where time held no meaning. His thoughts raced back to the cryptic journals, the warnings of those who had come before him. They had all spoken of the house's insatiable thirst for blood, but none had survived long enough to describe what came after. The manor's ritualistic hunger was not random. It was calculated, precise, and now Jonathan understood its purpose. His mind, racing with fragments of knowledge, remembered an ancient text he had once studied, a forbidden tome whispered about in academic circles, rumored to contain the secrets of opening gateways to dimensions beyond comprehension. The Necronomicon, the key to understanding the unknowable horrors of the cosmos. A terrible realization struck him. The manor wasn't merely a vessel of death, it was a portal. The blood sacrifices weren't just offerings, they were the fuel needed to breach the boundaries of reality. And each generation had unknowingly fed the house's purpose, their blood soaking into the very foundation, thinning the veil between worlds. Jonathan's blood, his very life force, was the final piece of the puzzle. With a growing sense of dread, Jonathan knew what was coming next. The house had been waiting for him, waiting for someone with the knowledge to unlock the ancient power buried within its walls. It wasn't enough for him to simply die. No, the manor needed him to complete the ritual, to bridge the gap between the mortal world and whatever lay beyond the veil. Jonathan's breath quickened. The air around him seemed to throb with an otherworldly pulse, and as he glanced at the floor beneath him, he saw the strange sigil again, the same twisted symbol that had haunted him since he first set foot inside. It glowed faintly now, pulsating with a sickly light that seemed to grow stronger with each beat of his heart. He had no time. Whatever the house had planned, it was already in motion, and he was powerless to stop it. Suddenly, a faint sound reached his ears, an almost imperceptible whisper, like the soft rustling of leaves on a windless night. Jonathan froze, his heart pounding in his chest as he strained to listen. The whisper grew louder, and soon it became clear that it was not just a random noise. It was a voice, no, voices, murmuring in a language he could not understand. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, as if the very walls were alive with the echoes of countless souls trapped within the house's cursed confines. He spun around, his eyes darting across the room, searching for the source of the whispers. But there was no one there. Only shadows. Only darkness. Then, the voices became clearer. They were not speaking to each other, they were speaking to him. Jonathan, asterisk. The sound of his name sent a chill down his spine. He backed away, his breath catching in his throat. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening, but the voices grew louder, more insistent, their tone filled with a sinister malice. You cannot escape. The blood calls. You are the one, asterisk. He clamped his hands over his ears, desperate to drown out the voices, but it was no use. They echoed inside his mind, growing stronger with each passing second. The walls around him began to tremble, the floor creaking and groaning as though the house itself was awakening. Shadows twisted and writhed, forming grotesque shapes that danced in the corners of his vision. He could feel the presence of something vast and incomprehensible pressing down on him, suffocating him with its malevolent will. In a desperate attempt to break free from the overwhelming dread, Jonathan stumbled toward the doorway. But as he reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping him inside. The walls shuddered violently, and a low, guttural rumble reverberated through the floor, as though some colossal, unseen force was stirring deep beneath the earth. The ritual must be completed. The voices were a cacophony now, an unholy chorus of damned souls calling to him from beyond the veil. Jonathan's heart raced as panic seized him. He ran toward the windows, but they too were sealed tight, their glass opaque as though the very light of the outside world had been extinguished. Then, he felt it. A sharp, piercing pain shot through his chest, as though an invisible hand had reached inside him and grasped his heart. Jonathan gasped, clutching at his chest as his vision blurred. The room seemed to spin, and the sigil on the floor glowed brighter, pulsating in time with his rapidly beating heart. You are the key. Jonathan fell to his knees, his body trembling with the weight of an ancient curse that had been passed down through the generations. He could feel his blood boiling beneath his skin, his very essence being pulled toward the pulsating sigil. The room around him seemed to warp and twist, the boundaries between reality and madness unraveling before his eyes. As his vision darkened, Jonathan realized with a sickening certainty that he had never been meant to escape. The house had chosen him, just as it had chosen all the others before him. And now it would claim him. But this time, something was different. The house wanted more than just his blood. It wanted his soul, and it would stop at nothing to take it. The world had changed. For Jonathan, reality no longer held firm. The walls of the mansion seemed to melt and reform like liquid shadows, twisting in unnatural angles, as though the very architecture of the house had slipped beyond the laws of geometry. Time, too, lost its meaning. Seconds stretched into minutes, then hours, an eternity within the suffocating embrace of the cursed manor. He was no longer alone. In the dimness of the room, beyond the pulsing sigil, something stirred. At first, it was barely perceptible, a faint ripple in the air, a shiver of dark energy that crawled across his skin. But as the moments passed, the presence became undeniable, a vast and unseen force, watching him from the periphery of his vision. It was as if the mansion itself had come alive, feeding on his fear, growing stronger with each beat of his heart. Jonathan tried to move, but his body betrayed him. His limbs were heavy, weighed down by an unseen force, as though the very air around him had thickened, congealed into a suffocating mass. He could feel it now, something vast and unspeakable lurking just beyond the veil of perception. It was not a creature in the sense of flesh and bone, but a formless, malignant intelligence, a thing of the void. The voices returned, swirling in his mind like a blackened storm. The sacrifice must be made. The gate must open. His breath came in shallow gasps as the truth became undeniable. The blood, the deaths, the rituals, all of it had been leading to this moment. The house, an ancient relic from an era long forgotten, was more than just a cursed building. It was a bridge, a portal to something far older and far more terrifying than mere death. The sacrifices had been feeding the gate, each death thinning the barrier between worlds, until now, with Jonathan at its heart, the ritual could be completed. The sigil beneath him pulsed with a sickly, malevolent light, and the air grew colder still. He could feel the icy tendrils of the void wrapping around his body, pulling him closer to whatever unspeakable fate awaited him. His heart raced, pounding against his ribs like a frantic drum, and his mind raced with a singular, all-consuming thought. He had to escape. He had to get out. But the mansion had other plans. With a deep, guttural groan, the floor beneath him shifted, buckling as if the very ground itself were alive. Jonathan stumbled back, barely able to keep his balance as the floorboards cracked and splintered, revealing the dark, yawning abyss below. From the depths of that chasm, a sickly green light began to rise, illuminating the room in an unnatural glow. And with it came the stench of rot and decay, the foul odor of something long dead, and yet not quite dead enough. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The force pressing down on him was too great, too oppressive. All he could do was stare in horror as the floor gave way completely, revealing an ancient, stone chamber beneath the mansion, one far older than the house itself. The walls of the chamber were lined with runes, symbols not of any earthly origin, but of something far older, far more malevolent. The voices grew louder now, more insistent, as if they had been waiting for this very moment. The gate must open. The blood must flow, asterisk. Jonathan's pulse quickened as he realized what he was seeing. The chamber beneath him, the sigil, the whispers, it was all part of the ritual. The mansion had been built upon something far more ancient, something long forgotten by time. And now, with each generation's sacrifice, the barrier between worlds had been weakened. The house was not cursed, it was the curse. Before he could process this revelation, the green light from the chamber below intensified, and from the darkness rose something that defied all logic, all understanding. It was a mass of writhing shadows, an amorphous shape that pulsed and twisted, its form never settling into anything recognizable. It was both infinite and finite, a thing of pure, unrelenting malevolence. And from its core, Jonathan felt the cold, hollow gaze of something that had been watching him from the moment he had entered the mansion. A nameless dread filled him. His mind recoiled from the thing below, unable to comprehend its vastness, its terrible purpose. This was the source of the house's evil. This was what had fed on the blood of the innocent for centuries. It was not a spirit, nor a demon, it was something far older, something from the depths of space and time. A primordial force, waiting for the right moment to cross into the world of men. The gate had been opened. As Jonathan stood, paralyzed with fear, the formless entity reached out, not with hands or tendrils, but with its very presence. It wrapped around him, suffocating him in a cold, eldritch embrace, pulling him toward the edge of the chasm. His body moved against his will, his feet dragging across the floor as he struggled to resist. But it was futile. The thing below was too powerful, too ancient. It had waited for centuries, and now it would have its sacrifice. Jonathan felt the edge of the chasm beneath his feet, the abyss yawning before him like the mouth of some great, cosmic beast. The whispers in his mind became a cacophony, drowning out all thought, all reason. You are the key. You will be the blood. With one final, desperate scream, Jonathan felt himself fall. His body plunged into the void, the green light enveloping him as the darkness closed in. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the writhing, formless mass below, waiting to consume him. And then, there was nothing. Jonathan did not die in the conventional sense. When he fell into the abyss, into the very heart of that cursed chamber, he was not devoured by oblivion, but was instead absorbed into something far worse. His mind, his body, everything that had once been Jonathan Ashcroft, was torn apart by forces beyond human comprehension. And in those final moments of awareness, as his consciousness fractured into countless screaming fragments, he understood the horrifying truth. The mansion had not been built to house men. It had been built to house it. The thing from the abyss, the thing of shadows and unholy geometry, had existed long before the mansion or the human race. It was older than time itself, a creature not of this world, but of the infinite void between the stars. The blood sacrifices over the centuries had only been a means to maintain its tenuous connection to this reality, and Jonathan was the final offering. He was not the first, nor would he be the last, for the mansion would continue to draw new victims, each one bound to the same fate, becoming fuel for the ancient, incomprehensible horror. His last thoughts were not of fear or pain, but of cold, numbing acceptance. There was no escape from this. There had never been any escape. As Jonathan's mind dissolved, the mansion groaned once more, settling back into its eerie, death-like stillness. The sigil on the floor dimmed, the green light fading until the room was plunged into darkness. The chasm below sealed itself with a slow, grinding sound, the ancient stones sliding back into place as if nothing had ever happened. The house was quiet again. But deep within its walls, something stirred. The malevolent presence, having fed on Jonathan's essence, grew stronger, more sentient. It had been waiting for eons, feeding slowly on the blood of the sacrifices, growing in power. And now, with Jonathan's final offering, it was nearly ready. The barrier between worlds had thinned, and soon, very soon, it would break. For now, the house waited. As it had always done. As it always would. And in the quiet corners of the mansion, in the creaking of the floorboards and the whispering of the wind through the broken windows, there lingered an echo, a distant, almost imperceptible sound that carried with it the scent of blood and ancient, unspeakable fear. The curse would continue. The mansion would stand for another generation, waiting patiently for the next historian, the next curious soul, to stumble upon its haunted halls. And when they did, it would be ready, as it always had been, to claim them. For the mansion did not hunger for life. It hungered for death. The blood must always flow.